We just saw an example of what's called a GET request, where we gathered data from recipes on Epicurious. Most of the time, that's what we want to do when we're scraping data from the internet. But there are times when we want to do what's called a POST request, where we communicate some data to a server. And where this ends up being most useful for us is when we need to use some credentials to access a web page that contains data that we want. So just keep that in mind. This is an example of how a POST request works in practice. And this example just goes through logging into the New York Times website. So I won't go over that in detail, just wanted to point that out to you. This video is mostly about a very common type of web data called JSON. I'm not an expert on this per se, but I need to share all of the terms and principles with you so you have some familiarity with it and know that this is a common type of data that you encounter. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, but people pretty much always just call it JSON. It's used to essentially publish data so it can be stored and moved around. It's easy to read and it's easy to interchange. It's very portable. And it's useful for representing and storing semi-structured data, and you'll understand that a little bit more when you see examples. This part right here has to do with how JSON is stored. I just know that this is important because we need to sometimes decode our data, and it's helpful to know what kind of coding is used. So we come across byte strings or UTF-8 strings, and that's plain text. This is what JSON looks like. Here's an example. I don't have that example right now, it went away. We'll see an example later. Right now we'll talk about JSON constructs and Python equivalents. So essentially our goal right now is to be able to move back and forth between a JSON representation and Python representation for data. And here we see some of our familiar data types that we've worked with, data structures as well. Essentially everything in Python is an object. So we kind of use that term very liberally to describe anything, any kind of variable or data, but an object sometimes refers to a particular type of data structure, the equivalent of which is a dictionary in Python, which we saw a little bit about earlier in class today. So just notice that even though we have the same things, they are referred to by different names, so they have different data types. And this chart kind of gives you a crossover between the two. How are we going to deal with Python and JSON objects? What we're going to do is use a library called JSON, which is used for converting text to and from the JSON format. So once we import the JSON library, we can use the functions, and we mostly care about just two of them. And actually, we care more about the first one. So to convert a JSON string into a Python object, we use the function .loads. So JSON.loads, and then the argument is a string. If we want to go in the other direction, we would use JSON.dumps function, and we would input a Python object. So let's see this in some examples. Here we are importing the JSON library from Python. We're defining a variable called JSON data, and we have to notice that this will always be inside of a string. So JSON is always a string. Now within that string, we have things that look familiar. We're going to use Python data as the name of our variable. We're going to assign that to the converted data. So we're converting the data using JSON.loads, and we're putting in the JSON string into here. and then we'll see that it has been converted. It looks pretty much the same. The only thing that's different is it's not inside of a string. But what's happened now, and we'll see in the next example, is we've all of these data types are now recognized in the Python context. So the outermost element is a list. We can see by the square brackets. And that's a Python list. Well, we can check the type to be sure. The first element is converted into a dictionary. So there's only one element in this list, and it is a dictionary. Inside that dictionary, we have keys and values. The first key is the letter A. It's a string. And then the value is actually a list that contains 2 integers. So here we can provide an extra check to be sure that the data that was converted from JSON is now in fact Python data. And this first one right here, I'm just printing the data itself, the Python data, and I'm going to print the type of that Python data. Next, I'm printing the first item in that list, and we notice the first and only item in the list is the dictionary. And I'm going to print to be sure that it is in fact a dictionary. Notice what this line here is doing. I am selecting from within the object. So this is kind of what we mean by semi-structured data. We have things within things, and they're all nested. So Python data, select 0, select the first item in the Python data, and then further select. So from that, I'm selecting the first key, which is the letter A, and just to be sure, I'm checking that it's the right type. If I run this, I'm going to get back, just to illustrate and understand this, getting back the data and the type of data for each of these commands here. We'll get better at selecting items from within data structures. So again, I just want to keep emphasizing that JSON data has to be contained within quotes because it's always a string. That's part of what makes it so portable. It can be a huge, huge long string, and that is much easier to move around the internet between clients and servers. But then we have to work to get it into a format we can use. Here's just a quick example of Python dumps, which just allows us to go in the other direction. We won't use this as much, but it's good to know about.